The air is thin and cold above Lake Erie, Ohio. It is 1937 at Camp Perry, the U.S. national matches. 100 shooters lie prone in the sand, rifles steady on heavy canvas mats. The early sun flattens the range into a shimmering mirage. A distant gong waits exactly 1,000 yards away. A man in a worn leather shooting jacket tightens the sling around his upper arm. The rifle in his hands is no museum piece, though it looks like one, a long, blued steel bolt-action with deep British roots, stamped pattern 1914. He exhales slowly. Metal clicks. The shot cracks like a whip. A pause. Then the faintest metallic ring from half a mile away. The scorer raises a white disc. Another bull. Around him, shooters with newer Springfields and custom target rifles glance over. The old pattern 1914 has done it again. Calm, precise, and utterly predictable. What made this aging rifle, born before the trenches of the Somme, still outshoot modern designs in American hands 3 decades later? That answer begins long before Camp Perry. In the mud, mistakes, and mechanical genius of World War I. The story of the pattern 1914 begins not in America, but in Britain, and not in triumph, but in frustration. After the Boer War ended in 1902, the British Army faced a grim lesson. The Mauser rifle had humiliated its Lee Metford and Lee Enfield designs at long range. Boer commandos, firing 7,57 vid Panani Mausers from rocky ridgelines, outranged British troops by hundreds of yards. Each hit seemed to whisper that accuracy mattered as much as volume of fire. In the years that followed, British ordnance engineers began sketching what they hoped would be a new standard rifle, the pattern 1913 Enfield, chambered for an experimental high-velocity .276 cartridge. It was meant to combine Mauser-like strength with Enfield-style speed. But the Great War arrived before it could mature. Logistics, not ideals, decide what soldiers carry. The British Army couldn't change caliber mid-mobilization, so they rechambered the design for the standard .303 British round. Thus was born the pattern 1914 Enfield, a hybrid of old ammunition and new mechanics. Production was the next problem. Britain's arsenals were already overwhelmed, turning out Lee Enfields. To fill the gap, they turned west, to American factories. Winchester, Remington, and the government-owned Eddystone plant began producing the P-14 in vast numbers. American engineers adjusted gauges and tooling to their standards, building rifles that were as over-engineered as they were accurate. When the United States entered the war in 1917, the British contracts were winding down. The U.S. Army urgently needed rifles. Millions of them. It had far fewer Springfields than it had soldiers. The simplest solution was to adapt what was already being made. American factories rechambered the British design for the U.S. 30-06 cartridge. The rifle was redesignated the U.S. model of 1917, but soldiers still called it the Enfield. By war's end, more than 2 million M1917s had been produced, more than all M1903 Springfields combined. Doughboys carried them through Belleau Wood, the Meuse-Argonne, and beyond. The rifle's distinctive ears protecting the rear sight and its heavy, steady feel made it instantly recognizable. When peace returned, the M19-117 didn't vanish. Thousands were stored, sold, or rebuilt. For a generation of American marksmen, these rifles became affordable tools for long-range experimentation. They were heavy but rigid, with a massive receiver ring and a rear aperture sight mounted farther from the eye than on the Springfield, creating a longer sight radius and finer control. By the 1920s and 30s, at civilian clubs and the national matches at Camp Perry, the M1917, or its near twin, the original P-14, became quietly respected as a precision platform. Skilled shooters appreciated its cock-on-closing action, which allowed faster, smoother follow-up shots when prone. Gunsmiths rebarreled and glass-bedded them, discovering that the stiff receiver and deep bolt lug seats minimized shot dispersion. While the U.S. Army celebrated the semi-auto future with the M1 Garand in 1936, America's long-range community kept trusting the old bolt gun. The pattern 1914 lineage had something most newer rifles lacked: predictability. At 1,000 yards, where mirage and wind rule, predictability means survival, or a championship. As Europe fell into turmoil again in 1939, few imagined that this 30-year-old rifle design would still be firing in anger. Yet history would demand it. By 1941, Britain was desperate again. The Home Guard armed itself with anything that could fire. Thousands of P-14s returned across the Atlantic, serving side by side with the Lee Enfield once more. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American ordnance planners faced their own sniper crisis. No standardized scope rifle, no clear doctrine, and few trained snipers. The modern rifles were coming. The M1 Neen 03A4 Springfield with its scope mounts, and later the scoped variants of the M1 Garand. But in those early months of global war, something older quietly proved its worth once again. On the range, in training, and occasionally in combat. The rifle designed for a war gone by still whispered its lessons to those who would soon fight another. And that is where the second part of this context begins. When the world goes back to war, and old steel must answer new questions. By 1942, America's factories were roaring, but its doctrine for snipers was barely whispering. The U.S. Army had no dedicated sniper school, no standardized optics, and no unified understanding of what a sniper was supposed to do. In the interwar years, the lessons of World War I marksmanship had faded beneath the machine age's promise of volume fire and mobility. When U.S. troops landed in North Africa and later in Italy, they carried rifles that reflected this philosophy. The standard M1 Garand was fast and semi-automatic, a mechanical marvel for general infantry use. But at long range, its 8-round clip and service-grade barrel made it less than ideal for surgical shooting. For designated precision work, the Army hastily fielded the M1903A4 Springfield, essentially a hand-selected bolt-action rifle fitted with a commercial Weaver 330C scope. It worked, but only just. The A4's scope offered limited magnification and a narrow field of view, and its mounting erased the rifle's beloved iron sights. In damp or muddy conditions, optics fogged, zeros shifted, and glass cracked. The weapon was officially modern, but those who had trained for years on open sights sometimes found themselves handicapped, and in the shadows of supply depots, armorers and sharpshooters whispered their preferences. The older M1917 Enfield had the traits long-range shooters trusted most: a long, heavy barrel that held its zero, a strong receiver that absorbed recoil evenly, and an aperture rear sight that could be adjusted precisely for elevation. At ranges beyond 800 yards, it wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. The Marine Corps had its own parallel path. Marines entering the Pacific Campaign relied heavily on the M1903A1 unertl combination. Older Springfield rifles paired with hand-fitted, high-quality optics. Yet even there, riflesmiths frequently spoke of the M19117's potential. Its sight geometry, with the rear aperture far back on the receiver, gave an almost optical feel to sight alignment even without a scope. Back home, at Camp Perry and smaller state matches, American marksmen kept testing these old rifles. Reports in period shooting journals like The American Rifleman and Arms and the Man documented 1,000-yard groupings that rivaled or surpassed newer models. The pattern 1914's front-heavy balance resisted wobble. Its two-piece bolt lug seating distributed stress evenly, and its threaded barrel shank was exceptionally consistent. Every marksman who laid behind one learned the same thing. Accuracy wasn't always about innovation. It was about control. The rifle demanded discipline, but it repaid precision with consistency, shot after shot. Meanwhile, U.S. Ordnance continued standardizing sniper gear for mass production. The Army favored rifles that could be assembled, shipped, and maintained in the millions. That logic sidelined the M1917, whose manufacturing had ceased 2 decades earlier. The Army couldn't restart production lines just for a few thousand sharpshooters. But in scattered field reports, from Italy, from the hedgerows of France, from the islands of the Pacific, certain names and rifles appeared again. Soldiers trained in civilian marksmanship units, NRA-affiliated clubs, or ROTC programs often brought their old habits and sometimes their old rifles into the field. When their issued scopes failed, they fell back on what they knew. To them, the Enfield pattern wasn't nostalgia. It was reliability under chaos. It fired when wet, stayed zeroed when dropped, and held a group at 1,000 yards, even with worn ammunition. The logic was timeless. When you can't trust the weather, your logistics, or your optics, trust the physics of steel and sight radius. This convergence between institutional pragmatism and individual experience created one of those quiet ironies that fill military history. The same U.S. Army that proclaimed its belief in new technology kept producing snipers and marksmen who swore by an older rifle's feel. By late 1944, the pattern 1914 spirit, rigid, mechanical, honest, had seeped into new designs and new doctrines, but among those who cared most about hitting distant targets, its reputation only grew. And that is where the story widens, beyond factories and policies, into the personal, mechanical, and moral angles that explain why this old rifle kept winning where newer ones stumbled. Before technology, there is touch. Every great marksman learns that the rifle is an extension of breath, pulse, and patience. In interwar America, long-range shooting was not a military science. It was a culture. Civilian clubs, veterans, and weekend competitors at Camp Perry and Quantico treated marksmanship as both sport and meditation. Most of them learned behind rifles descended from the pattern. 1925 Inandrin Kane T14. Its ergonomics were peculiar. By modern standards, long, heavy, forward-balanced. But in the prone position, it anchored the body. The weight dampened tremor. The aperture sight allowed the eye to center naturally on the target without conscious alignment. Every muscle learned to stay still for seconds that felt like minutes. Those habits mattered later. When soldiers found themselves on wind-swept ridgelines in Italy or among hedgerows in France, they fell back on the same breathing cycles, the same sight pictures. The pattern 1914 lineage had trained an entire generation not to rush a shot. Newer rifles could be faster. Few were calmer. In the end, the Enfield pattern's greatest gift wasn't accuracy, it was discipline. Mechanically, the pattern 1914 and its American cousin, the M1917, were overbuilt. The receiver walls were thick, the bolt massive. Where the Springfield relied on the Mauser's dual front lug lockup, the Enfield design featured a slightly different geometry that distributed stress more evenly through the bolt body. The result was stiffness, the enemy of barrel whip, and the friend of consistency. At 1,000 yards, consistency decides everything. The rifle's cock-on closing action gave shooters smoother bolt manipulation while staying on target, particularly when firing from the prone position. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant the rifle didn't jump between shots. The long sight radius, nearly 31 inches, allowed subtler corrections for elevation. Barrel harmonics mattered too. The heavy contour and bedding system produced tight vertical groups. In field tests at Aberdeen and later at Springfield Armory, M1917 rifles averaged smaller groups at 600 and 1,000 yards than standard M1903s. The pattern 1914's critics called it outdated. Yet its designers had unknowingly created a marksman's chassis decades before the term existed. Strong, steady, predictable. Modern rifles would evolve lighter, faster, more modular. But in that distant era, the Enfield pattern embodied something more elemental, a tool that simply didn't move when you pulled the trigger. In 1943, few U.S. soldiers trusted optics. Most issued scopes were commercial hunting models, sealed with shellac and hope. They fogged under humidity, lost zero when bumped, and offered less magnification than the human eye under mirage. For those who had learned to shoot the pattern 1914, the solution was simple. You didn't need glass to hit distant targets. You needed geometry. The rifle's peep sight sat close to the shooter's eye and used a battle aperture smaller than any other service rifle of its day. When adjusted carefully, it allowed fine elevation corrections to 1,600 yards. Shooters who mastered its arc could read wind and holdover with uncanny precision. Optics might magnify. The Enfield taught understanding. It forced the shooter to read mirage, grass sway, and dust, the language of distance. Even decades later, veterans who had learned on the Enfield design spoke of its sights as pure honesty. There was no lens to blame, no fogged reticle, no cracked mount, just steel, breath, and judgment. It wasn't that they distrusted scopes. They distrusted uncertainty. And nothing was more certain, at 1,000 yards, than that circular aperture and the front blade within it. For all its human steadiness, mechanical rigor, and optical simplicity, the pattern 1914 story was never just about craftsmanship. It was about systems, decisions made by generals and logisticians who valued mass production over precision, quantity over culture. And that brings us to the next perspective, the bureaucratic and battlefield angles that decided what rifles soldiers actually carried into war. In war, logic often loses to logistics. For every rifle a sniper praises, there are 10,000 that must be manufactured, shipped, and maintained. By 1942, U.S. ordnance officials were staring at one of the largest mobilizations in history. Every decision had to serve mass production, not perfection. The pattern 1914's tooling had vanished from factories 2 decades earlier. Restarting its lines would have cost time and steel the Army didn't have. The M1 Garand and M1903 Springfield already shared parts, gauges, and trained labor forces. They could be turned out by the millions, and so, on paper, the P14 M19-117 was obsolete, not for performance, but for paperwork. Colonels and procurement boards weren't chasing 1-inch groups at 1,000 yards. They were chasing rifles per hour. The Enfield pattern's long bolt throw and heavier frame didn't fit the new infantry vision. Yet, the irony lingered. The Army had chosen the Garand to win today's war, while competitive marksmen quietly knew that the old Enfield could still win tomorrow's shot. Efficiency triumphed over excellence, but the shooters would not forget. By 1944, on the rolling fields of France and the rocky ridges of Italy, the sniper duel had become an intimate chess match. German marksmen with Carabiner 98K ZA-42s or G43 semi-autos controlled open ground, forcing American infantry to fight from cover. For U.S. shooters trained at long range, this was the arena they'd prepared for all their lives. The challenge wasn't courage, it was physics, crosswinds, light refraction, and target concealment. At 1,000 yards, new rifles mattered less than known behavior. A shooter who knew exactly how far his bullet dropped at 900 yards, who trusted his rifle's minute of angle shifts, held the real advantage. The old Enfield pattern, with its heavy barrel and stable bedding, gave predictable flight. Shot to shot, day to day. While official sniper units were rare, countless platoon-level sharpshooters became unofficial guardians of their companies. They fired from tree lines, church towers, or ridge outcroppings, using rifles they had either been issued by chance or rebuilt themselves. When you had one shot before the enemy relocated, predictability mattered more than prestige. And in that contest, the 30-year-old design still whispered steadier truths than most modern rifles could deliver. Every marksman's confidence lives somewhere between weapon and will. At 1,000 yards, belief in your rifle becomes as tangible as steel. The pattern. 1914's longevity wasn't only mechanical, it was emotional trust. Soldiers who had trained with it before the war or shot it in competition described the same feeling. The rifle didn't argue. Its recoil was firm but smooth. Its rhythm, honest. You learned its quirks, and it rewarded you for knowing them. That familiarity bridged wars. A young corporal, barely trained, might receive a modern Springfield with a scope but little instruction. Another, older marksman might still have access to a worn M1917 from storage. He would lie behind it, dial windage on its rear sight, and exhale through the same ritual as in peacetime matches. The difference was spiritual. The first hoped the glass would hold 0. The second knew his iron sight would. That certainty, that quiet handshake between shooter and steel, defined much of America's marksmanship. Ethos long after World War II, because a weapon's legacy is not in its serial number or date of design. It's in the steady hands that still, decades later, trust it to hit the unseen. Leadership, engineering, and human spirit had all played their parts, but rifles, no matter how precise, only proved themselves under pressure, under fire, under fear, under wind. And that brings us to the moment of decision, the climax, when old steel meets modern war, and the pattern 1914's reputation is tested on real ground once more. France, summer of 1944. The hedgerow country of Normandy is a sniper's nightmare, and a sniper's proving ground. Each field is boxed by earthen banks and thick hedges, centuries old, high as a man, deep as a trench. Visibility stretches no farther than the next field until, suddenly, it opens into a 100-yard gap where any movement becomes a target. Private Earl Haskett, 29th Infantry Division, had grown up shooting woodchucks in the wind-whipped farmlands of Pennsylvania. His rifle wasn't a brand-new M1903A4. It was an M1917 Enfield pulled from the unit armory, heavy, unfashionable, but well-maintained. Its blued finish had long dulled to a gray patina, and its rear aperture sight bore the faint smell of oil and age. In the hedgerow maze, modern optics failed fast. Fogged glass, cracked lenses, bent mounts. But Haskett's rifle, iron-sighted, solid, kept its 0. At 300 yards, at 600, and once, at almost 900, he found targets by sound, breath, and dust movement. Each shot came down to timing, not technology. Reports from company commanders echoed the same pattern. The official sniper rifles were delicate. The obsolete Enfields were stubbornly consistent. Across Europe, similar stories surfaced. In Italy's Apennine Mountains, a detachment of the 10th Mountain Division fought its way through sleet and fog. At those elevations, scope lenses froze solid. Condensation turned into ice crystals. The soldiers adapted, wiping lenses with cloth, breathing warmth onto them. But when nothing helped, they reverted to old rifles from stateside storage depots. The M1917, with its thick barrel and simple iron sights, simply worked. Even British and Canadian observers took note. Many of them had once trained on the pattern 1914, calling it the straightest rifle ever built. Its accuracy had been legendary in the Great War, second only to the German Mauser for precision, and its ruggedness had endured. In one engagement near the Gothic Line in 1944, an American platoon reported returning fire on German positions 900 yards away. The fog obscured movement, the scope reticles were unreadable. One marksman, using a borrowed M1917 with open sights, made 3 confirmed hits at long range. The platoon report, archived later, noted simply, "Shooter reported rifle steady and 0 reliable at extended range." It wasn't dramatic, but it was telling. When modern rifles failed under weather, stress, or mass production tolerances, the old steel stayed steady. Meanwhile, the Army's official sniper doctrine was evolving. By late 1944, the first scoped Garands, the M1C prototypes, began limited trials. They offered semi-automatic fire with 2.2x magnification optics. But early field tests revealed flaws: heat mirage rising from the gas system, complicated mounting, and loss of 0 after heavy use. The brass wanted progress. The shooters wanted performance. For many frontline units, that meant trusting what they already had. The pattern, 1914 M1917, was no longer standard issue. But neither was it forgotten. At the same time, American competitive shooters and ordnance engineers began to collect data from the field. Range officers at Aberdeen Proving Ground and Camp Perry ran comparative accuracy tests between the M1903A3, M19117, and M1 Garand. The results were quietly circulated. At 600 yards, the M1917 often grouped tighter than the Springfield. At 1,000 yards, its heavy barrel delivered smaller vertical dispersion. It wasn't faster. It wasn't lighter, but it hit where it was aimed. Those numbers didn't change Army doctrine, but they shaped the mindset of an entire post-war generation of shooters. In Normandy, the sun was dropping low over the hedgerows. The smell of cut grass mixed with cordite and rain. Private Haskett had fired less than 20 rounds that day, each deliberate, each measured through breath and time. When his squad leader asked how he kept his rifle so steady, he shrugged. "It's not me, sir. It's the old gun. It knows where to look." That phrase would find its way into later interviews, quoted in a local paper decades after the war. Because in that summer of mechanized warfare, tanks, aircraft, rockets, an aging bolt-action rifle quietly reminded the world that accuracy is timeless. Still, there would come one more test, a day when the wind shifted, when distance stretched to its limit, and when all that mattered was whether old steel could still reach as far as men's courage. Belgium, January 1945. The Ardennes lay frozen under a pale sun that gave no warmth. The Battle of the Bulge had twisted roads into traps, forests into corridors of sound and death. German paratroopers and SS units hunted through the snow for any sign of movement, their own Mausers ready. On the American side, rifles jammed from cold oil, optics frosted over, wind cut through every fold of cloth, and distances that once felt simple now seemed endless under the gray light. In a makeshift foxhole near the village of Foy, a sergeant named Mark R. Alden checked his weapon, not the sleek Garand most carried. His had frozen solid 2 days prior. Instead, he cradled an M19117, borrowed from a rear echelon supply unit. It was pitted, worn, its stock sanded smooth from decades of handling. But when he cycled the bolt, the action moved like clockwork. The wind came from the east that morning, around 10 knots. Across an open field, nearly 900 yards away, German machine gunners had set up in a shattered farmhouse. The squad's Springfield sniper couldn't get a clear view. His scope fogged, his breath freezing against the lens. Alden lay flat, wrapped in a wool blanket stiff with ice. He dialed the rear sight up 8 clicks, exhaled, and waited for the wind to pause. When the shot broke, it cracked sharp and dry, cutting through the winter air. The rifle recoiled heavy but smooth. Half a second later, a faint clatter of falling metal. The farmhouse gun fell silent. He worked the bolt, chambered another, fired again. 2 shots, 2 hits. The men beside him didn't cheer. They just watched in disbelief as the old rifle, older than most of them, spoke with the same calm precision it had 30 years before. The pattern 1914's spirit, born from Britain's desperation, refined by American engineering, had come full circle. That day was not an anomaly. Reports from across the Ardennes recorded similar moments. Small, unglamorous victories where experience and reliability meant more than design age. Snipers and sharpshooters, who could no longer depend on fragile optics, turned again to aperture sights, estimating holdovers by feel, counting clicks in the dark. An ordnance note from the 101st Airborne's weapons officer, preserved in wartime archives, reads, "Weather-causing scope failures. Recommend issue of standard iron sight rifles to marksmen until conditions improve. M1917 performing reliably. No fanfare, no headline, just acknowledgement that the old rifle outshot the new when it mattered most." After the bulge, snow began to melt, and the Allies moved east. The war was turning, but in that brutal winter, when machines froze and men faltered, the rifle's mechanical honesty had been a small anchor of certainty. It symbolized something deeper. In an era that worshipped progress, here was proof that not all progress meant better. Sometimes older meant stronger, because it had already been through everything the new hadn't yet faced. The M1917 would never again be standard issue. The Army would transition to semi-automatics, to scopes with nitrogen seals, to lightweight alloys. But for those who fought through that winter, the rifle had earned quiet immortality. When Alden returned home to Ohio after the war, he joined a local rifle club, the same one where, years earlier, men had fired the pattern 1914 at Camp Perry's distant targets. He bought a surplus M1917 for $20 and spent weekends firing at the 1,000-yard line. His groups were small, his breathing steady. When asked once why he preferred an old bolt gun, he smiled. "Because it does exactly what I tell it. No more, no less." That statement, simple and unremarkable, carried the same truth that wartime had taught him, and countless others. The pattern 1914 was never the future. It was the standard by which the future was measured. And from the quiet fields of Perry to the frozen hedgerows of Europe, it had proven, one measured shot at a time, that precision doesn't age. Only the men who remember it do. As the rifles cooled and Europe thawed, armies took inventory. Old designs went to storage or sale, but their echoes remained, in doctrine, in training, in every post-war match fired across America. What came next was peace, industry, and memory. The aftermath, when the war's survivors and engineers took stock of what truly worked and what didn't. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the United States found itself with more rifles than soldiers. Warehouses from New Jersey to California overflowed with stacked steel and oiled wood. Garands, Springfields, carbines, and thousands of M1917 Enfields. To the ordnance clerks who processed them, these were surplus. To the marksmen who had lived behind them, they were history. The M1917 was officially declared obsolete. Production had ceased in 1919, and no one expected it to return. Yet, its record spoke quietly for itself. In both world wars, it had proven robust, accurate, and forgiving. virtues that even modern rifles sometimes lacked. In the first months after the war, ordnance reports began to circulate within the Army's training command. They weren't celebratory, just methodical data. The Aberdeen Proving Ground evaluations from 1946 compared the long-range dispersion of the M1 Garand, M1903A3, and M1917 under identical conditions. The Enfield design, despite its age, consistently produced smaller vertical deviation at 600 and 1,000 yards. It wasn't supposed to be that good anymore, but steel doesn't understand obsolescence. It only obeys physics. Meanwhile, at Camp Perry, the national matches resumed. Surplus rifles flooded the civilian market through programs like the Director of Civilian Marksmanship, DCM. Veterans could buy the same rifles they had carried, sometimes for less than the price of a good pair of boots. On those firing lines, the old Enfields began to sing again. Men in khaki shooting coats lay prone under the Ohio sun, sighting through the same apertures their fathers had used. At 800 and 1,000 yards, the pattern repeated. Slower bolt work, heavier recoil, but superb precision. Many custom gunsmiths recognized the potential. The M19-117's receiver became a foundation for target and hunting rifles well into the 1960s. Its action was strong enough to chamber magnum calibers, its bolt smooth enough for competition tuning. Names like Griffin and Howe, Sedgley and Parker Hale turned war surplus rifles into civilian masterpieces. In an ironic twist, the obsolete rifle became one of the most sought-after platforms in American sporting history. Its DNA even influenced post-war designs abroad. Echoes of the Enfield's receiver geometry can be seen in commercial rifles from Remington and Winchester decades later. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, moved forward. The Garand became iconic, a symbol of American firepower. The M1C and M1D sniper variants, now refined with better optics and mounts, replaced the bolt actions in doctrine. Yet, even these semi-automatic successors inherited lessons learned from the old Enfield's stability. The importance of bedding, barrel contour, and sight placement were all concepts the Pattern 1914 had quietly proven in practice. In training circles, especially among the Marines and the Army Marksmanship Unit, instructors continued to reference the Enfield when teaching sight alignment, breathing control, and trigger squeeze. Its simplicity made it the perfect example of what precision should feel like. Beyond the range, the rifle's legacy grew in quieter ways. Collectors sought them out for their craftsmanship, deep machining, perfect bluing, walnut that had aged to honey brown. Veterans who had trusted them in snow and mud passed them to sons and grandsons as heirlooms, each rifle carrying the ghost of a 1,000-yard echo. One ordnance historian later wrote, "The M1917 was the rifle America built for someone else, then used to prove itself twice." That paradox captured its essence. A rifle born from compromise, perfected by need, and vindicated by time. But the story doesn't end with collectors or competitions. Its real aftermath lies in the shift it inspired, in how armies, engineers, and marksmen redefined accuracy itself. Because the Pattern 1914 had shown that precision wasn't a feature. It was a philosophy, and that philosophy would shape every rifle designed in the decades to come. By the early 1950s, the thunder of a new world had replaced the rifle fire of the old. Jet engines, atomic weapons, and mechanized divisions defined military strength. Yet in the quiet corners of training fields and rifle ranges, the echoes of the Pattern 1914 still lingered. Instructors in the newly formed U.S. Army Marksmanship Training Unit often began classes with a familiar ritual, a demonstration of what perfect sight alignment looked like through an aperture rear sight. They still used the M19-117 as a teaching tool. Its simplicity, its long sight radius, its natural eye alignment all made it ideal for illustrating marksmanship's timeless principles. The military had moved on to the M14, and soon the M16, both lighter, faster, and designed for mobility. But the lessons of the Enfield pattern shaped how these newer rifles were judged. Designers spoke of receiver rigidity, bedding integrity, and harmonic stability, terms born from the mechanical realities of those older bolt actions. Civilian shooters, too, carried the torch. The National Rifle Association's high-power competitions expanded rapidly after the war. Rifles based on the M1917 and its British cousin, the P14, dominated the 1,000-yard categories for years. Many were rebarreled too. 30-06 or .300 Magnum, glass-bedded into new stocks and fitted with finely tuned triggers. But at their heart, they remained the same rifles that had crossed the Meuse or held the line at Bastogne. The community that had trained America's wartime. Marksmen, the clubs, the veterans, the machinists, built a bridge from the trenches to the future. They taught that the rifle was never the true weapon. The marksman was. The rifle was only the tool through which discipline, patience, and understanding became visible. Even as optical technology advanced, from 2.2x hunting scopes to variable 10x military optics, the pattern 1914's design continued to whisper one final truth. Precision starts in the barrel, but it lives in the mind. By the 1970s, historians had begun to look back on the M1917 as a footnote in the vast industrial story of American arms. But among serious riflemen, it was remembered differently as the rifle that never lied. It shot straight when others didn't, because it had been built for a war that punished imperfection. Across the Atlantic, Britain's influence lingered too. The Enfield pattern had given birth not only to the U.S. M1917, but also to the T-Series sniper conversions, the No. 4 T rifles, and ultimately the design philosophies that shaped the L-42A1 sniper rifle in the Cold War era. Even as rifles evolved into precision tools for special operations, the ghost of the pattern 1914's geometry, its long sight line, its bolt strength, its calm shot cycle, remained. There was another kind of aftermath, quieter still. In the basements and workshops of returning veterans, fathers and sons rebuilt surplus M1917s together. They scrubbed old bluing, polished bolts, replaced stocks, and took them to the range. The rifle became a bridge across generations, a shared ritual of focus, patience, and craftsmanship. Each click of the rear sight drum carried the memory of those who had once adjusted it in combat wind. Each fired case was another reminder that tools built for necessity can outlive the wars they served. One such rifle, a Winchester-made M1917, with faded parkerizing and initials carved into its stock, hangs today in the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. The plaque below it reads simply, "Trusted at 1,000 yards, 1917 to 1945. That line, understated and true, could summarize the rifle's entire journey. When the modern era finally arrived, of laser rangefinders, ballistics computers, and composite barrels, the Enfield pattern stood quietly behind them all, a ghost of steel and wood that had proven something timeless. Technology advances, but marksmanship does not evolve. It endures, and from that endurance grew the final chapter, not of war, but of memory. The reflection, where steel, history, and human will converge into a single lasting truth. Every generation believes its tools are the pinnacle of progress. War, that belief is often shattered. sometimes by the enemy, sometimes by the weather, and sometimes by a rifle designed 30 years earlier. The pattern 1914 and its American twin, the M1917, were not legends because they were new. They were legends because they worked, through mud, through frost, through the thousand small failures that erase the weak and vindicate the honest. History tends to celebrate innovation. The semi-automatic Garand, the scoped Springfield, the precision rifles that came after. But beneath all those triumphs lies a quieter truth. The rifle that endures does so not through novelty, but through integrity. The Enfield pattern was born of necessity, refined by patience, and trusted by those who understood that at long range, perfection is not speed or style. It is stillness. Its story is not really about wood and steel. It is about people, the machinists who cut its lugs with obsessive care, the soldiers who learned to breathe between heartbeats, the competitors who measured wind by feel, and the generations who discovered that accuracy has no era. Even today, on modern ranges with rifles half the weight and 10 times the optics, the fundamentals remain the same. Align, breathe, press, follow through. Those words could have guided a marksman at the Somme in 1916, or a sniper at Bastogne in 1945, or anyone, anywhere, trying to bring order to chaos, one steady trigger pull at a time. The pattern 1914 outshot every modern rifle at 1,000 yards, not because it defied progress, but because it defined principle. Steel can rust, wood can crack, but principle endures. And in that endurance lies the quiet heart of marksmanship, the belief that calm, discipline, and truth can still reach across impossible distance. That is why, even now, a century later, the echo of that old rifle still carries on the wind. A single, perfect shot, ringing faintly from 1,000 yards away.